They said he was too smart for his own good. But those who really knew him called him a miracle. Javon Carter was just 10 years old, yet he walked through the worn brick halls of Booker T. Washington Elementary like a young scholar in a world that had no idea what to do with brilliance wrapped in brown skin. He was the kind of child teachers remembered for years, bright eyes that flickered like sunlight on water, a mind that danced through math problems like music, and a curiosity that could outlast the sun. By 5th grade, he was reading at a high school level, solving algebra equations during lunch, and tutoring classmates twice his age without ever making them feel less than. Javon was more than gifted. He was gentle, funny, deeply respectful, the type of boy who held the door for teachers and helped his grandma carry groceries without being asked. But even that wasn't enough to shield him, because this town didn't care how smart a black boy was. It only cared how quiet he stayed. It was a Wednesday, just after lunch, when the principal's voice crackled through the intercom. "Javon Carter, please report to the front office." His classmates looked up, confused. Javon never got in trouble. Not once. He looked just as puzzled. His heart skipped, not in fear, but in the way kids do when something unusual happens. Maybe he'd won a prize. Maybe someone noticed the poem he'd slipped into the school newsletter. With his oversized backpack slung over one shoulder and his science notebook still in hand, Javon stood and walked the long hallway toward the office, unaware that every step was taking him closer to a moment that would split his life in two. Mrs. Pittman, the secretary who usually greeted students with peppermints and soft smiles, avoided his eyes that day. The warmth in her face was gone. So was the candy dish. She pointed to the side office. Inside sat Principal Meyer, mid-40s, square glasses, and a reputation for being tough but fair. Except fair didn't look like this. 2 uniformed police officers sat beside him, their notepads already out, their eyes already hard. Javon froze in the doorway. "Come in," Principal Meyer said, voice flat. "We have a few questions." "What's going on?" Javon asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Javon," Meyer said, folding his hands like he was about to give a sermon. "A student reported seeing you take money out of Miss Bentley's purse during recess. Is that true?" Javon's face scrunched in disbelief. "What? No, I didn't. I never even touched her purse." Meyer's lips thinned. One of the officers stood. "Son, we're going to need to check your belongings." Javon instinctively took a step back. "I didn't do anything," he repeated. "I swear." But it didn't matter. His backpack was unzipped. Books spilled out. His science project, a homemade solar system made from styrofoam and paint, rolled onto the floor and cracked. And then there it was, a crumpled $20 bill inside the front pouch of his bag. It was over before he could even say another word. The money might as well have been a grenade. The room shifted. The officer leaned in. "Where'd you get this, son?" Javon's voice shook now. "My grandma gave it to me this morning for my field trip." "Can we call her?" he asked. But no one answered. Principal Meyer turned to the officers. "You know what to do." And just like that, a 10-year-old boy, who had never once been sent to detention, who had dreams of becoming an engineer, who wrote poems about space and light, was placed in handcuffs inside the very building that once celebrated his intelligence. The hallway was empty when they walked him out, but the windows weren't. Eyes watched. Whispers started. By the time Javon's grandmother arrived, her face lined with panic and tears, the damage was done. Her boy, the boy she raised with bedtime prayers and Sunday choir rehearsals, was sitting in the back of a squad car like a criminal. No one apologized. Not that day. Not the next. Instead, a letter was sent home. Student under investigation for theft. What no one mentioned in that letter was that there were no fingerprints taken, no surveillance footage checked, no interview conducted with Miss Bentley, who later admitted she wasn't even missing any money. It turned out another student, well known for acting out, had whispered the lie as a joke, never thinking it would go that far. But the system didn't care about that detail, because it had already made up its mind the moment Javon walked through that door. A black boy with money in his bag had to be guilty. The next morning, Javon didn't want to go back to school. His grandmother tried everything. Eggs the way he liked them, warm tea with honey, even singing his favorite hymn softly from the kitchen. But he just sat on the edge of the bed, shoes untied, eyes hollow. "I didn't even cry," he said. "Not when they grabbed me. Not even when they laughed." She brushed his hair with slow hands. "Why, baby?" "Because if I cried, they'd think I was weak. Or lying. Or dangerous." She didn't answer. She just held him, long and tight, the way black grandmothers have always held the world's cruelty at bay. That day, she didn't send him back to school. She sent him to her sister's house 2 towns over. And quietly, without telling the school, she started looking for a lawyer. Because the world may not have seen her grandson's worth, but she did. And she was going to make sure everyone else saw it too. Even if it meant tearing the whole system apart, the story might have ended in silence. Just another black child buried beneath the weight of false accusations, if it hadn't been for Mrs. Elaine Morris. She wasn't the loudest teacher at Booker T, Washington Elementary, nor the most decorated. She was the kind of woman who wore long cardigans and shoes that squeaked when she walked. The students called her Miss M because it felt friendlier than Morris, and because she was the only one who still believed in handwritten praise on homework papers and sitting cross-legged with her students during story time. She had taught 5th grade for over 20 years. She'd seen shy kids bloom and bullies turn soft. But in all her years, she had never seen a child quite like Javon Carter. He didn't just learn. He lit up the room with learning. He devoured books like meals, asked questions that pushed even her to research more. Once he stayed after class just to debate whether time travel could ever be ethical. What if going back to save someone messes up the present? He'd asked with eyes that sparkled like stars. Elaine had laughed that day, then paused, because she realized he wasn't just playing with an idea. He was wrestling with something deep: moral consequences, responsibility, cause and effect. It was the type of philosophical musing college students barely grasped. And this boy was 10. So when Elaine heard what happened in the office, the arrest, the accusation, something inside her snapped. At first, she couldn't believe it. She was in the teacher's lounge when whispers started trickling in. "Did you hear? Javon Carter got caught stealing. The principal called the police on him. They found money in his bag." The stories didn't make sense. They were stitched together with bias and assumptions. And worse, none of the teachers questioned it. They just nodded solemnly, accepting it like bad weather. But Elaine couldn't accept it. Not Javon. Not the boy who once gave his lunch to another student because they forgot theirs. Not the boy who tutored 3 kids during recess just because he said, "It helps me remember better when I explain it." So she walked out of the lounge and headed straight for the front office. "What exactly happened?" she asked the secretary, who stiffened when she spoke. "It's an internal matter, Miss Morris. The principal is handling it." Was the teacher whose purse was allegedly stolen even present during recess? "Again," the secretary said, lowering her voice, "this is being handled." But Miss Morris wasn't the kind of teacher who left justice to be handled. She walked back to her classroom, shut the door, and started gathering facts herself. First, she spoke to the students. Carefully, quietly. She didn't want to spark rumors or ignite more shame. She simply asked who had seen what. One boy admitted he'd overheard a student say something as a joke. Another girl said she saw Javon reading under the tree during all of recess. He never even went near the teacher's lounge, where the purse supposedly was. None of the stories matched the version she'd been told. Then she looked into the school's policies. If the school suspected theft, there should have been a review. Mediation. Parental contact. Not handcuffs. Not police. By Friday, Elaine had a folder of notes and witness statements. She didn't want to go to war, but she knew she had no choice. So she marched into Principal Meyer's office, folder in hand. "I need to talk to you," she said firmly. Meyer didn't look up from his screen. "I'm in the middle of something. It's about Javon Carter." That made him look up. "Miss Morris, this matter is settled. There was evidence." "No," she said, voice trembling with controlled fire. "There was suspicion. and assumption, and fear, but no real evidence, no inquiry, no due process. You let police handcuff a 10-year-old boy in front of the office based on hearsay, based on the word of another child who later admitted it was a joke. Meyer leaned back in his chair. He had the money on him. So, you didn't even call his guardian to verify. You didn't check camera footage. You didn't speak to the teacher whose purse was supposedly stolen. Do you understand what you did to that boy? You branded him. You humiliated him. You could have ruined his entire future. Silence. Then Meyer said the words that would haunt her for weeks. Maybe now he'll think twice before getting involved in something he shouldn't. Elaine's hand clenched the folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. Maybe you should think twice, she said coldly, before deciding a child's worth based on his skin color. She left the office before she said more, but she didn't leave the fight. That weekend, she did something few teachers dared to do. She contacted the press. She reached out to a local black journalist who had covered school disparities before. She provided documents, anonymous statements, and a detailed account of what happened. Within days, the story was live. Gifted black student handcuffed after false accusation at school. It spread like wildfire. Local parents were outraged. The PTA demanded answers. Community members showed up at the school board meeting in protest. And most importantly, Javon's grandmother saw the article. Until then, she had been quietly seeking legal advice, unsure if anyone would believe her side of the story. But now, the truth was out, and she wasn't alone anymore. She reached out to Elaine Morris and thanked her, not just for standing up for Javon, but for being the kind of teacher who remembered that her job wasn't just about grades, but justice. That week, Principal Meyer was placed under administrative review. Miss Bentley released a statement clarifying that no money was ever missing, and the student who made the false claim was disciplined, though not nearly as severely as Javon had been. But none of that could erase the image burned into the hearts of those who witnessed it, that of a 10-year-old boy, gifted and gentle, being treated like a criminal in the very school that should have been his sanctuary. Still, something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, the town started asking harder questions. And for the first time in a longer while, someone like Miss Morris had chosen to not look away. Because when systems fail children, it takes people of conscience to break the silence. And sometimes one voice is enough to start an earthquake. The town hall building had never been so full. A line of cars snaked around the block, headlights glowing against the setting sun. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of concerned parents, local activists, community elders, and even quiet onlookers who'd only come to watch, but couldn't ignore the gravity of what had happened. They weren't just here to discuss education. They were here because something sacred had been broken. A 10-year-old black child had been treated like a criminal, and the town was wide awake now. In the third row, Javon sat beside his grandmother, Miss Evelyn Carter. Her hands, weathered and wise, rested protectively over his. She wore her Sunday church hat even though it was a Wednesday evening. There was no scripture reading today, but she had come for truth and justice, and that required the same solemnity. Javon, in a clean white polo shirt, stared at the floor. He hadn't said much in the past few days. Not since that awful moment when his wrists were bound by plastic cuffs and his innocence was stripped in public. But he had agreed to come, because Miss Morris had asked, and because somewhere inside, a quiet part of him still believed this wasn't the end of his story. Miss Elaine Morris stood near the podium with a small stack of papers and a heart pounding like a drum. She hadn't planned on speaking first, but when the school board opened the floor, no one else stood up. So she did. Her voice trembled at first, but as she read, it grew steadier. "I've been a teacher in this district for over 20 years, she began, and I've taught hundreds of students. Some brilliant, some difficult, some who needed love more than learning. But I have never, not once, seen a child treated the way Javon Carter was treated last week. Not by the police, not by a principal, not by an institution that claims to care about children." She paused. The room was still. "I've collected statements from students. None of them saw Javon near the scene of the alleged theft. I've reviewed our school policy. Nowhere does it permit police intervention without parental contact or basic due process. What happened wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others clutched their chests. But in the back row, Principal Meyer sat stone-faced, his arms crossed tightly. Elaine continued. "This child," she said, motioning toward Javon, "is not a threat. He's a gifted student, a kind friend, a curious soul who dreams of becoming an engineer. And yet, none of that mattered the moment someone decided to see him not as a boy, but as a problem." Her words cracked slightly on that last line. She ended by saying, "If our schools cannot protect children like Javon, then we are failing our most sacred duty. And I, for one, refuse to let this moment pass without change." As she stepped away from the mic, there was a beat of silence, then slow applause, then louder, then a standing ovation, not just for her, but for the courage it took to speak truth in a room full of power. Next came Miss Evelyn. She didn't need notes. She walked slowly to the podium, her cane tapping softly on the floor, and looked out at the crowd with eyes that had seen segregation, riots, and the long march of history repeating itself. "I raised Javon," she said, "after my daughter died giving birth to him. He's all I have. And when I heard that he'd been handcuffed, my first thought was, not again. Not another black boy being punished just for existing." Her voice was quiet but carried weight like thunder. "Do you all know what it feels like," she asked, "to see your child come home broken by the same people meant to protect him?" No one answered, but many bowed their heads. I taught my grandson to read by age 4. He was doing fractions before most kids could spell their names. But none of that mattered to them. All they saw was skin. That's why I'm here. Because if we don't stand up for him, what hope do we have for the next child? Tears glistened on her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. She didn't need to. When she stepped down, a hush fell over the room again. Then, something unexpected happened. A man rose in the middle aisle. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. People turned to stare. "My name is Officer Daniels," he said. "I was the responding officer that day." Gasps spread through the crowd like a wave. Daniels cleared his throat. "When I got the call, I was told there was a juvenile theft suspect. I was told the child had been seen with stolen money. I didn't know the kid. I didn't ask enough questions. I acted like a cop, not a human being." His voice cracked. "When I put those cuffs on that boy, he looked up at me like he didn't understand what was happening. And the truth is, I didn't either. I went home that night and looked in the mirror. I've got 2 kids. One of them's 10. And I realized if someone had done that to my son, I'd be out for blood." Silence. "I can't undo what happened, but I am sorry, truly, and I promise to testify in any review process that this was not handled right. Not by me, not by the school." He sat down, head bowed. No applause, just raw, stunned quiet. By the time the school board finally spoke, the room was simmering. The board president, a middle-aged man named Gerald Nash, looked visibly shaken. He shuffled papers before speaking. We hear the concerns. This is deeply troubling. We will be launching an independent investigation into the actions of both the principal and involved staff. Furthermore, we're committing to racial bias training, policy reform, and a full review of police engagement in our schools." It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And in the corner, Javon looked up at Miss Morris. For the first time since that awful day, he smiled. Just a little. Because for a brief, shining moment, the community had done something rare. It had believed a black child. It had stood up. It had demanded more. And Javon realized maybe he wasn't just the victim of a broken system. Maybe he was the beginning of something better. The morning after the town hall, Elaine Morris stepped onto the school grounds with a strange tightness in her chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something heavier, a quiet, gnawing tension that came from knowing she had crossed a line. Not a line of morality or principle. No, she had walked that line with pride, but she had crossed the invisible boundary that teachers weren't supposed to touch. The one that said, "Stay quiet. Don't challenge the system. Don't rattle the cage." And now the cage was rattling back. Her usual morning routine had changed. Where she used to be greeted with warm nods or casual hellos in the faculty lounge, she was now met with stiff glances, shallow smiles, or worse, complete avoidance. Her colleagues who had once shared lesson plans now kept their conversations short. A few even turned away when she passed. Principal Meyer, unsurprisingly, had not said a word to her, but his silence spoke volumes. It dripped with condescension, pulsing with the subtle threat of retribution. Elaine didn't regret what she said, not a single word, but she wasn't naive. She'd been in this system too long to expect that justice would come without cost. That week, her classroom was randomly inspected 3 times by administrative staff. She received an email questioning her curriculum materials for political bias. Parents who had never contacted her before were now writing to the school board, complaining that she was creating division in the classroom by bringing race into everything. None of it surprised her. What did surprise her, though, was how lonely it all felt. She'd expected more teachers to speak up, especially the ones who had whispered frustrations behind closed doors. But most of them went silent the moment the spotlight turned hot. It reminded her of something her grandmother used to say. Everybody loves revolution until it costs them comfort. Still, Elaine held her head high, because this wasn't about her. It was about Javon. It was about every student like him who deserved to walk into a school and be seen not as a threat, but as potential. But the wear was real. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would sit with a cup of tea and feel the loneliness settle in her bones. She wasn't a protester by trade. She was a teacher, a woman who loved books and believed deeply in her students. But now she was also a symbol, and symbols don't get to rest. Meanwhile, the fallout spread beyond the school. Javon, despite the small win at the town hall, was still grappling with the trauma of being criminalized at 10 years old. Every time a police cruiser passed their block, his body stiffened. He'd started sleeping with the lights on. He no longer walked to school. His grandmother now dropped him off every morning and picked him up every afternoon. He didn't talk about what happened, but it lived inside him, curled tight like a knot in his stomach. One day, while Elaine was sitting at her desk grading papers, she heard a soft knock at the door. It was Miss Carter, Javon's grandmother. "I know you're busy," she said gently, "but I wanted to thank you in person. What you did, it meant the world to us." Elaine smiled, her eyes weary. "He's a good kid. He didn't deserve any of this." "No, he didn't," Miss Carter agreed. Then she hesitated. "But it's not just about Javon anymore. What you did gave a lot of people permission to care out loud. I've seen it." Elaine tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Miss Carter pulled a folded flyer from her purse and laid it on the desk. It read, "Community Forum on Equity in Schools, hosted by Concerned Parents for Justice." "We're organizing," she said. "Not just black parents either. Teachers, neighbors, even a few officers. People are tired, and you helped us realize we don't have to be quiet about it anymore." Elaine looked at the flyer, her heart stirring. The cost of speaking up had been high, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. Still, the system hadn't stopped fighting back. That Friday, Principal Meyer called her into his office. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice cold. "Your public statements have created a perception problem for this school. We're under scrutiny now. The media is watching. The district is watching." Elaine didn't flinch. "Good. Maybe they'll finally see what we've ignored for too long." Meyer narrowed his eyes. "This isn't about race, Miss Morris. It's about protocol. It's about order. You undermined this institution." "With all due respect," she said firmly, "this institution undermined itself the moment it let a child be treated like a criminal without a shred of proof." Meyer leaned back, his jaw tight. "You're on notice. Keep your opinions out of the classroom. And if you continue to stir up unrest, we'll have to reevaluate your position here." Elaine stood slowly, meeting his gaze. If speaking up for children puts my job at risk, then maybe this isn't the place I thought it was." She walked out, heart pounding, fists clenched. The following week, news broke that the district had placed Principal Meyer under review. The pressure from parents, media outlets, and advocacy groups had become too great. A petition calling for his resignation had gained over 10,000 signatures. And Elaine, she received a letter from the superintendent, an apology for the way she'd been treated, and a promise to begin implementing district-wide equity policies, starting with police interaction protocols. It wasn't perfect. The work was far from over, but it was movement. It was proof that when one voice speaks boldly, it can ripple outward. Elaine returned to her classroom the next Monday and found a note on her desk. It was from Javon, written in neat, careful cursive. It read, "Dear Miss Morris, thank you for standing up for me. I want to be a teacher one day, just like you. Javon." She held the note to her chest and wept, not from sadness, but from hope, because she knew then, in the deepest part of her soul, that no matter how high the cost, speaking up had been the right thing to do. And in that moment, surrounded by books and children and the faint light of a new day, she realized something powerful. Change doesn't begin in courtrooms or board meetings. It begins in classrooms with truth, courage, and the willingness to stand alone until others find their voice too. Justice didn't arrive with sirens or sweeping speeches. It came quietly, almost unceremoniously, in the steady changes that followed. Small things, at first. Things easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The school's front office replaced its zero-tolerance policy plaque with one that read "Compassion First." A new set of classroom posters showed diverse children with messages like, "You belong here, and we see you." The resource officer who once patrolled the hallways in tactical gear was reassigned, replaced by a school counselor trained in trauma-informed care. The ripples from that single, harrowing incident with Javon had become waves. The district implemented training for staff on unconscious bias and student dignity. Teachers who once dismissed Elaine's concerns were now attending after-hours forums and parent meetings. For the first time in a long time, it felt like change wasn't just something they talked about. It was happening. But for Javon, healing wasn't just policy or paperwork. Healing was slow, personal, uneven. Even after Principal Meyer's resignation and the district's apology, Javon still flinched when he heard a police siren, still scanned the street when walking with his grandmother. Trust, once shattered, takes a long time to rebuild, especially when it was never given freely to begin with. One afternoon, as the golden light of spring poured through the classroom windows, Elaine invited Javon to stay behind after school. She was holding a small box. "I've been keeping this safe," she said, placing it gently on her desk, "and I think you're ready." Javon opened the box slowly. Inside was a worn library card, the kind from back when books still had pockets in the back and stamps for return dates. His name was written on it in faded blue ink. "I found that in the back of one of the shelves," she explained, smiling. "It was the first book you ever checked out when you were in first grade. You were so excited. You asked if you could keep the card." Javon smiled quietly, running his fingers across the card. "I kept it because I knew," Elaine continued. "I knew even then you were special, and I also knew the world would try to tell you otherwise." His smile faded a little, and he looked up at her. "Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I am anymore, like I'm just that kid who got in trouble." "You're not," she said gently. "You're more than what happened to you. You're who you choose to be after it." It was the kind of moment no policy could manufacture. Human, raw, real. And that, more than anything else, was what justice looked like. It looked like a child remembering he was more than a headline, more than a statistic. Javon eventually began to find his footing again. He joined the school's new debate team and took part in the student council. His essays, once hesitant and guarded, now brimmed with boldness and purpose. One of them, titled "What They Didn't See," earned him statewide recognition in a youth writing competition. In the essay, he wrote, "When the police saw me, they saw a threat. When my school saw me, they saw a disruption. But when Miss Morris saw me, She saw a story, and because she believed in it, I learned to believe in it too. It moved people to tears. At the award ceremony, when Javon's name was announced, Elaine stood in the back of the auditorium, with tears silently sliding down her cheeks. He walked across that stage not just as a boy who survived injustice, but as a young man who'd begun to reclaim his narrative. Meanwhile, the town changed too. The community group, led by Javon's grandmother, grew stronger. They held monthly forums, created mentorship programs, and partnered with local officials to hold schools accountable. Parents who once felt powerless found themselves seated at decision-making tables. What started as a cry for help had become a movement for transformation. Elaine, though still under quiet scrutiny from a few corners, found support in unlikely places. One day, a fellow teacher who had always kept his distance approached her in the hallway. "I didn't say anything back then," he admitted. "I was scared, but I watched what you did, and I want to do better. I want to help." She didn't need an apology. What she needed, what the children needed, was action. And slowly, people were beginning to act. Months later, Javon stood in front of his entire school during an assembly. This time, not as a child being punished, but as a speaker invited to share his story. The same auditorium that had once buzzed with gossip about his suspension now listened in reverent silence. "I used to think justice was something that happened in courtrooms," he said. "But now I know. It happens in classrooms, in kitchens, in community halls. It happens when someone refuses to look away, when someone decides that silence is no longer an option." He paused, then smiled directly at Elaine. "It happens when a teacher sees you not just as you are, but as who you can become." Applause echoed through the building, long and thunderous. After the assembly, Elaine stood outside the school doors, watching Javon hug classmates and shake hands with parents. He glowed with something she hadn't seen in him in a long time: freedom. As the crowd began to thin, he walked over to her, still holding the speech in his hands. "Hey, Miss Morris," he said shyly. "I was thinking about being a teacher. Like you." Elaine's eyes welled up. "I think you'd be the kind of teacher the world needs." In that moment, standing beneath a sky that seemed a little brighter than before, justice no longer felt like an idea. It was a boy with a future, a community refusing to forget, a woman who risked everything to tell the truth. And that truth was simple. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. It was about making sure the next child didn't have to carry the weight Javon did. It was about love louder than fear, about voices stronger than silence, and about stories told not to relive the pain, but to make sure it never happened again.